All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to the August 17th Policy Committee. And we will start with any announcements.
There are no announcements this evening.
Okay, and to the committee, are we okay to move the minutes forward to the legislative? Yes, okay. And we have all first readings tonight, and we will start with 121.
So policy 121 is district-sponsored student travel. As we take a look at this policy, we want to make sure that we make clear in the language that all students are welcome to participate in school district-sponsored travel and that they would not be prohibited from doing so because of any financial barrier. So I'll walk through a couple of the changes that we made. Remember, these are just first readings, so they'll be back next month, and we can tweak any language that we need to make or change. So if you look at the purpose statement, we want to, in the last full sentence, we want to take the word however out. However, the safety and welfare of students, ... We want to just make that the safety and welfare of our students. And in the second to last sentence, we wanted to say, all eligible students shall be welcomed to participate in travel regardless of their ability to pay. Again, looking at through an equity lens, we don't want to provide, or we don't want to put up a barrier that prevents access and opportunity for students. The definitions are there, so what constitutes a field trip, a class trip, and then the guidelines. Throughout the guidelines, you will see that we made just a few changes as we put titles in policies. We're trying to be mindful that we don't call out specific positions, but we rather, like when we talk about a chief academic officer, we're really talking about the individual involved in curriculum. So that way it might not always be Dave Hoffman that looks at that, it might be another administrator. And then as you move through, you will see that we made a number of other changes, rearranging some things, but on the whole, there aren't a tremendous number of substantive changes to this policy. So I wanted to bring it in this form to see what the committee thought and if there are any additional changes that we think need to be made.
Jenna?
So, Dr. Yanni, the first thing you mentioned, I don't see that, you mentioned something about a change to the however. I don't show that on my red line.
No, you wouldn't.
Okay.
We just, yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay, so that's, okay, perfect,
Yeah.
okay. I was worried I was looking at an old version. So, okay, putting that aside, I had two comments on this. The first one is, and this is just funky wording to me. There's a couple places where we talk about we want to make sure that provisions are made for students, quote, who might be eliminated from participation because of finances. I totally know what you're getting at with that. It just sounds a little odd to me, so.
We can make that language a little softer.
Yeah, I mean, the point we're trying to make, of course, is, you know, if there are students for whom the trip poses a financial burden, we will help them, and, you know, so just the concept that we would ever eliminate anybody for finances, the wording wasn't my favorite, that's all. And I think that's in number 3 under the guidelines, and then number 5 under delegation of responsibility. The other change I had was a little bit of a nit, but under the number 6 for guidelines, where it says the board does not endorse, I would change that to the district. And then, you know, title of the policy is district-sponsored student travel. I mean, I do think because we are talking about non-district sponsored, it probably does make sense to just say student travel.
Agreed.
Right, yeah.
Agreed. And just for formatting, delegation of responsibility will be moved prior, you know, before before guidelines. One of the things that I'll just remind everyone, the board doc system is not super user-friendly, and when you're moving large portions of text, sometimes it's better to do in Google Docs and then copy and paste back in. So those types of things Brooke and I will get taken care of before it comes back in any form.
Jeff, you ready? No. Mark?
Just a couple. The administrator responsible for curriculum, I understand what you're trying to get at there. But I'm more comfortable with having a title there and having to change it in the future if the title changes than this, because do you mean necessarily a central administrator? Could that be a building principal? I mean, it clearly says administrator, but I don't know that it's going to be apparent all the time who that is.
Let me put it, I'm hesitant to put a title in, and we've refrained from that in other policies, but I think maybe we can put something like the central office administrator in charge of curriculum.
Okay, that would help there. In item 3 under guidelines, a new language, the board directs that. I don't think it's necessary. The board directs the whole thing. It's a board policy.
Where was that?
It's new language under bullet 3 under guidelines. It says you can just strike the board directs that. Provisions are to be made, I think, is good enough. I don't understand, I know this isn't new language, it just got relocated, but recruiting of students by district employees for non-school sponsored trips must first, so this is by district employees, if they're employed by the district and they're recruiting Girl Scouts to go on a Girl Scout trip because they're also a Girl Scout leader. Why? Are we saying because you happen to be employed by the district, you have to get permission of the principal, even for something that's,
Correct.
okay. And is that what we need or want?
I don't know that we necessarily need to be tied to that, because I don't know how you necessarily enforce that. I looked in a couple of our, I always look at our peer districts. Lower Marion, for example, because we share a solicitor, they have the very similar policies. It's located in, or that language is in their policy as well. As we think about it, if it's a non-school sponsored trip, we technically don't have any authority over the trip. Ideally, we don't want that recruiting happening during the school day, because that's not the function of what we employ people to do. So let me think about that if it belongs.
If that's what we mean, if we mean recruiting of students at school, then I think it should say that.
That, I think, makes it clear, right?
Yeah.
So any recruitment done during the student day.
Yeah. Because if a teacher is a Girl Scout leader and completely outside of school is recruiting girls to go on a Girl Scout trip, I don't see why they should have to ask their principal first.
Mark, an example of that is, say the band teacher does a summer program in Europe, not involved with the district. It's a statewide of maybe concert bands that they go over there. That, I think they should not recruit during the day. I think where this was going.
Yeah, that makes some sense to me. But it's during the day.
Right, and then
that's the
the
key
question
there.
too is email, can they send email to students to
Yeah,
solicit?
using their school address or using
Right,
the
that's
student's
where it
school
was
address.
years ago. Yeah, that's where we.
But if they get permission, then they can recruit per this line of the policy. That would be correct, right?
Yeah, yes.
Right, they would need to get permission to use school resources to do their recruiting. That's really, I think, if you're using school resources, including time, then you need permission. Yeah, I think that's really what it's trying to say. Yeah, thank you.
But I do have a question about that, because we want to make sure that the students don't think it's a school-sponsored trip. I always feel weird when we're telling teachers what to do, so I feel like we tell the administration how they're supposed to do it.
Yeah, I was going to say, while we're on that point, on number 5, do we need to make clear assuming this is correct, that there's no district responsibility. I mean, we say in number 6 that if there's a staff member who does a trip that's not approved, we don't endorse or assume responsibility. And number 5, if permission's granted, we say we don't endorse the trip. Do we need to have some legal language there to say we don't assume responsibility for it because we're not sponsoring it? We might want to check with the solicitor on that.
I can add that.
I think if the language in 5 were clear that you may not use school resources to do your recruiting, then maybe that gets obviated, but it's a good question to ask the solicitor. But if it's really about the use of school resources for the purposes of recruiting, I think then it simplifies the question.
So we'll work up those changes. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Walk.
Can I add one more? I'm
Sure.
sorry. In the purpose section, two things, one minor and then just one conceptual. What's currently the second to last sentence, where we're talking about district-sponsored outside events, which is a defined term, and then we talk about class trips, which is a defined term. I think we got to include student competitions there because that's also a defined term, and it's a different activity than travel, I think. Or at least think about that, whether that should be there. And then my only other point was that we say student trips in the first sentence, and then we talk about student travel. We might make that consistent. And then the second sentence where we talk about foreign countries and exchanges almost seems like to me that's a definitional sentence rather than purpose. And maybe it should be somewhere in the definition section, like under field trip or class trip, wherever it is properly placed. So just a couple little nits, Dr. Yanni, as we're looking at that.
That's a good catch. Back to, I have one under number 7 under guidelines. It says that the board may direct the superintendent to make a recommendation. I mean, the board may direct the superintendent to do whatever we choose to direct you to do. I don't feel like that language is necessary.
So even though that language is underlined, that's because it was moved out.
I recognize it's not new language. Is the purpose, I guess I'm asking, do we think the purpose of this sentence is to preserve the option for the board to make a statement when these sorts of things happen? We always can do that. I mean, are we explicitly delegating authority to the superintendent to do that, or are we saying the superintendent has to ask us before doing that? I don't understand what it's here for. What I know none of us wrote it, but what might have been the goal here?
I think the purpose of the language is, and it wouldn't necessarily apply to our board, but in a district where the board wouldn't want to say no trip because something was going on abroad, they would make the superintendent make that decision. So it would be the superintendent, quote unquote, being the bad guy to cancel the trip rather than the board. That's how I interpret it. Or the hero. Yeah, or the hero. Hero or anti-hero, depending upon the trip and who's
Well,
going.
right. Well, in this case, we could direct the superintendent to make a recommendation. The recommendation could just as well be worth going ahead with the trip,
Correct.
which is why I don't understand the purpose. It doesn't seem to do anything.
And is it inconsistent with number 6 under delegation of responsibility, where that has been delegated to the superintendent or designee? I mean, do we need to?
Well, the superintendent shall develop procedures,
Right, it's
Including
already
that.
delegated to me
not to make the decision necessarily. The delegation isn't the decision. The delegation is
To write
procedures for implementation.
right.
But if there's a right to cancel, no?
Develop procedures for the right to,
Oh, and so if part of those procedures are to come to the board, then the sentence above is unnecessary? And I'm not saying that,
okay, let me start from the beginning. Does the board want or need to reserve authority or explicitly delegate authority to make these kinds of decisions?
maybe even before we get to that question, this only applies to non-school sponsored trips. Why would we be even commenting in the, I mean, if we say we, disclaim all responsibility for non-school sponsored trips, I don't want you to talk about them, right? Like, no, it's not me. So I don't know, maybe that, I know that was the original language as well. I checked. It also said non-school sponsored trips, but that was even before we get to your question. Yeah.
I think we as a board want to, as Jenna says, if it's a non-school sponsored trip, other than the use of school resources to recruit or whatever, hands off, right? As much as possible. So I may just strike this. Yeah.
I'm very comfortable with that. I don't think we should be getting involved in decisions that aren't ours to make. Remember how I said this year policy was going to be easy?
Did you invite me?
What nights are you not for? Or all right, well, so we'll work on that and bring that back next month. The next policy is 122, extracurricular and co-curricular activities. So a couple of years ago, districts stopped using the word co-curricular. Everything's really extracurricular now. I left the co-curricular in there just because I wanted that to be a talking point. I didn't want to strike everything and have you all think, like, what's he doing? But really, co-curricular things are not necessarily a thing anymore. Everything that we're really talking about is extracurricular. And I think there was at least one other policy back when we were doing policy during the day and we had Ken Roos here. We had the co-curricular, extracurricular conversation.
Yeah, I seemed it had something to do with the federal, maybe it was Title IX or something. Some
think it
federal
was.
regulation drove that change of terminology, but I don't remember the specifics.
So the name of the policy will be changed to extracurricular activities. So we'll strike co-curricular. We did add language here to make sure that there are provisions in place so that students would not be prevented, not eliminated, but prevented from an activity because of an inability to pay.
Jeff?
Did you put in anything from Act 55 yet into this? I think for homeschool students, or is that going to be in homeschool in terms of how much?
Right, so that I have that as a talking point here as well, that we're
okay.
going to need to add
Great.
something in. Mhm.
So Dr. Yanni, if we're getting rid of co-curricular, do we need to then amend the definition of extracurricular? Because as I read the current policy, that the construct is extracurricular is not explicitly connected to academic learning. Co-curricular has some type of tie. So do we have to make extracurricular cover both of those now?
Exactly, so I'll work on that definition to make it broad. I'll actually take the two definitions and put it together as one. And then, as Dr. Levinowitz said, when I was going back over the new Act 55 language, students who are homeschooled need to be provided access to extracurricular activities. So we will, if they request, so we don't have to, we always do every year at the beginning of the year, send a letter to our homeschool parents and saying, like, these are the things that your students can participate in. But we'll put language in here that at PSBA's recommendation and at a couple other agencies' recommendation that we'll make it explicit that students that are homeschooled have the ability to participate.
And there is some language in the AR about that,
Right.
but it's not updated, is what you're saying?
Right, so
Okay.
I'll make sure that that's updated with Act 55 language, and I actually might steal some of that and put it into the policy. And then under authority, I have there, if you see my note there, move to guidelines. When I was looking at this policy again over the weekend, I wasn't sure if the board was going to be, or the committee was going to be more comfortable leaving that language in the policy as it is, or moving some of that or all of that into guidelines. So I wanted to open that up for some conversation.
When you say guideline, do you mean the guideline section in the policy, or do you mean in AR?
To guidelines in the
Okay.
policy, I'm sorry.
Right. Well, you already knew how I felt about that one. None of this is actually a statement of authority. I do have a question. So I think it should move to guidelines, but I do have a question about bullet 3 in there. New language standards shall be communicated in writing ahead of time, basically, before they become operable. Which begs the question, can I do it 3 minutes before they become operable? Or do we mean to have some amount of a reasonable time? And if so, does the board want to dictate a reasonable time, or do we want to delegate the responsibility for determining that time?
I would ask that would be delegated to me,
Yeah.
because I think to put that in policy, it will make this incredibly, incredibly messy.
Yeah, that was my thought too. I think we should say that it shall be communicated in writing with, a reasonable period of notice, and in the delegation of responsibility that should be one of the things included in the AR.
Jen? Couple of things. Under purpose, we state expressly it doesn't apply to interscholastic, intramural, or club sports, and I think that's because we have a separate policy on that. I'm just wondering if we should footnote a reference or somehow just make it clear that there's another policy that governs that and it's not an outlier. And there's a couple spots that I had noted, Dr. Yanni, in where it talks about eligibility and authority, where there seem to be differences between extracurricular and co-curricular, and I don't think we have to go through them now because we're going to meld it and make it one, but just something to flag as we're working on it.
Right, so I have that flagged for myself to take a look at, so that we make that clear and
Great.
clean in the revised version.
Perfect. And then just two other things. The very end, the last two paragraphs, I have a question about each of them. The second to last paragraph that talks about the authority for discipline, okay. In the very end, it says, to ensure that student attendance at such meetings is voluntary. And that phrasing, I didn't quite get it, because I know we're saying that extracurricular is voluntary earlier on, but if you become part of an extracurricular activity, can't attendance be mandatory? So it just seemed like odd language.
I'm sorry, Mr. Wallach, where are you?
I'm at the second to last paragraph, the very last phrase, the paragraph that starts, the district retains the authority. It's the very last phrase after the and to ensure.
Yeah, so it's in order to ensure, retains the authority to maintain order and discipline on school premises, to ensure that student attendance at such meetings is voluntary. That doesn't make any sense.
Right. I mean, we have the authority to ensure that student attendance at meetings is voluntary.
Well, so you're saying the and, the problem is the and.
Right.
It's what and what. There's actually 3 ors and 2 ands in this sentence.
Right.
So,
Mr. Sirota, were you on the, oh no, it was 15, I was going to say. I'm just waiting for the day that Mr. Sirota disagrees with language he wrote in
I'm
in a
sure I
policy
already have done that
previously.
at
I just, teasing.
I get better and better at it.
You do?
I mean, I'm allowed to evolve.
Correct, you are, for sure.
So what,
I mean, I guess I question, do we need the language after the and? Does it really do anything?
I don't think so. I think we can say the district retains and then put the period after the well-being of students and employees, period. Because I don't think we want a policy to say that meetings are voluntary or involuntary. Like that's not something that the board would be able to govern.
Great. And then my last question, the very last paragraph about application for use of school facilities. I get it, but I think we have other policies that talk about that. And I just want to make sure we don't have anything in conflict there, and to make sure if we're keeping this language here, it's consistent. So it's just something to note.
So we can look and we can cross-reference policy 707. That's the.
This one isn't 707.
What's that?
I think there may not actually be another policy. that
Oh,
covers
no,
this.
that's not, because
This is for student-initiated clubs.
Yes, that's 707 is public use of
Yeah.
facilities.
I mean, it might be in one of the student club policies that says something about facilities.
take
There's something in my brain that says we looked at that in the last year or so, but I could be completely confused, so.
I
I'll take
don't
a look at
remember
that in the
doing it
morning.
with regard to student And student-initiated clubs even is a weird phrase. We have clubs. We have, a student-initiated club a special thing? Is that different than any other club?
So, yeah, so student initiate, when kids come to us and say they want to have ABC club.
That's an application to become a club.
Right.
This is application for use of facilities by presumably a club that's been approved.
Right, because all of our clubs, so let me think about, so all of our clubs would have an advisor or an adult assigned to that club. So,
Right. It would already have been approved in that
Right.
case.
Right.
Application of use of
Right.
facilities by clubs that haven't yet been approved, like have a meeting to form a club, maybe? Maybe that's what this is about. Can we meet in a classroom in order to talk about forming a club?
but there again, I don't even know that anyone would ever come and ask us to say, hey, we're thinking about joining a club. Do I have to reserve a space? They would just,
they would just
right.
do it, yeah.
So I think, so let me take a look at, we might not need that language at all because we don't have an approval process. So for instance, MJ Lyons, when she's meeting with student government, she's not putting in a request to reserve the library after school. Like she's just meeting with them.
I have a question, going back to that word, the voluntary meetings. Was that for the co-curricular club? So like, I'm imagining the co-curricular was like, say it's the physics
That's-
club and it was required.
That's probably why that was in there, because co-curricular would be so tightly aligned to the academic program of the school. So when you take co-curricular out of that language, it's a good thing that we're striking that language, because that would have been language in there to support co-curriculars.
Anything else on that one? No. 140.
So 140 is charter schools. So the board, if there is an application for a charter school that's presented, the board has the duty to review it and either approve it or reject it. The reason I want to keep this policy very short is it seems like with every governor that we get, there is some change to the regulatory process for charter schools. So the policy itself is very, very brief. What Mrs. Ionetti pointed out earlier in the AR, in the AR, it talks about the district evaluating, so me evaluating the quality of an application before it's brought to the board. And what Mrs. Ionetti commented on was we should probably have the solicitor do that, because they're going to be far more equipped to look at, and so that way we're not using a direct district resource. We're not encumbering the time of the superintendent or the administrative team, but rather we're leveraging the support of our solicitor to see if it's an application that should be turned over to the board. So my recommendation is to keep this policy very brief as it is. We'll tighten up the AR, and this is one that I have flagged for review every year, because I would assume that despite how the governor race goes the next time, I do think that there will be some charter regulation changes that we should account for, either in the policy or in the AR.
I want to highlight this one actually has a meaningful authority statement. I think that's the first.
I'd like to say I wrote it, but I didn't. Mr. Sirota, that's probably because you wrote it in 2017.
Do we need a definition of application? Or is there a standard for what?
There is. I think that's a great idea.
Well, it's defined in the law.
Right.
So that could go in there.
One conceptual question. Dr. Yanni, I agree with you that the policy here should be short as it is and the AR the way it is. Conceptual question, however, there's a lot in this AR that's directing the board to do things in terms of timing of applications and things like that. And I just wanted to make sure we're all okay with that being in an AR.
So I don't think it needs to be even in the AR, because it's all guided by the law.
The law.
Right, right. And even having that level of detail in an AR, would mean that we would have to change that AR every time there's regulatory changes. So that's why I think Mrs. Ionity saying, rely on your solicitor, use the solicitor to guide you through, because it would be, in our case, Mr. Diazio saying, okay, you have a charter school application, here's what you need to do, and here's the outline, here's the steps that you need to take.
So to that end, your idea is to revise the AR. Perfect.
And really just refer to applicable law.
Okay, so that resolves one of my questions, which was, I did take a look at the law, and it's like pretty, like, very specific about what has to happen. So one of my big questions for the AR is, are we sure this all tracks? So I think your solution will eliminate that concern for me.
And quite frank, I'm sorry to interrupt,
No,
but
no, you're
quite frankly, the AR, in this case, might simply be a link to the school code that lays out all of those steps, because it is.
Very specific.
It's very, very specific.
So, okay, so that resolves that. Couple small things then. In the definitions, the first one talks about an appeal board, and then it references the charter school law. I don't know, like, I don't think there technically is a charter school law, like, you're referring to PA code, exactly. So, yeah, either we can define it as that if you want to keep using that term, or, just say applicable law or whatever. Either one is fine. And then I think there's 3 different places that it mentions that we have the authority to terminate or revoke a charter, including technically twice in the authority section. So I think just saying it was, so I counted 2 in the authority section, and I like the way the second one is worded better, actually, that, we have the authority in accordance with the law. So yeah, because the sentence before kind of says the same thing, it just doesn't say in accordance with the law, so I would probably pick the second one. And then I think it says it again. Number 8, under guidelines, says it again. It's a little more specific, via a majority vote, et cetera, but I don't know. Yeah. So again, I don't think we need to say it 3 times, but, and then the other one was, there's language at the end after guideline 8 that was deleted, that basically says the application must, have everything in it that the law requires, and I wasn't sure why we deleted that. That seems like a good thing to have in there.
Something like before the board would entertain, or enter step whatever of that long, complex process, that must be true. It may say that already in the law, but if it doesn't, I'm all for making sure that it's there before we start down the path, yeah.
But I think that deleted language is in number 1 under guidelines now, phrased slightly differently, isn't it?
I can take a look at that.
Anything? No? Okay, moving on.
The last policy is 144, participation in curricular programs and activities by economically disadvantaged students. So my philosophical question is this a standalone policy, or is it enveloped in everything we do? First of all, saying curricular, we're not going to deny economically disadvantaged students any curricular opportunity, so it would have to be extracurricular. We can have a standalone policy, but I also see us going into in our equitable practices policy, simply stating that students are never going to be prevented from participating due to a financial hardship.
As a programmer, I like code reuse. Like, I don't want to rephrase this entire paragraph in 15 policies. I'd rather just cite a policy that's already there. But this one is sort of weirdly specific because it's just about school-sponsored curricular activities. And I think it comes up just as often, if not more often, in other things. So I mean, it does speak to equity, though. Like, you could put this language in the equity policy, which also applies to everything, and have it there, that would be fine. But I wouldn't want to try to repeat it in all of the.
No. I would think of it as an addition to the equitable practices policy that then could be cross-referenced as we go through policies. I think it's 827 is our equitable practices policy. So then 827 would be referenced. And obviously, in the meantime, we're not going to allow students to be prevented from participating in something due to a financial hardship. And that's something that we have our leadership team retreat next week. And that is something, as we emerge from the pandemic and we resume normal types of things, we have to be extra vigilant about this year, because the last couple of years, things have been a little bit more free-flowing. But now we want to make sure that we get to the kids that might have a financial hardship that prevents them from participating in something.
Are there situations where somebody is not somehow identified as economically disadvantaged, but where there still could be financial hardships?
So,
I mean, that's,
Yes,
I
yeah.
think, the situation we're looking at.
right, the simple answer is yes, because economically disadvantaged, that designation is driven by free and reduced lunch. But there could be a family that either doesn't apply for free and reduced lunch, or that doesn't qualify for free and reduced lunch, but might have some significant financial difficulties. So I think that strengthens the position to put it into the equitable practices policy, and then have that cross-referenced.
And principals can, even if the child doesn't have the free and reduced lunch, that needs to be emphasized, that they can still help the students, because also, not only do they have to apply for the free and reduced lunch, but then once they're approved, they have to agree to share it. So, this forms could get lost.
Correct. And that's another thing that Mrs. Zainetti just brought up, that, the last couple of years, because breakfast and lunch has been free, the free and reduced lunch process has not been really emphasized. So as we come back to school, that's something that we need to make sure that we emphasize, that people see it over and over and over and over and over again, and that principals are talking about it at back-to-school nights, and that it's in newsletters and on social media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, so that we cast the net wide enough that families that need that support will have it.
And I know sometimes guidance counselors they're in the know, so that would be something maybe in the AR, I guess, that they would either be able to help them or go through the principal. Okay, just want to make sure.
It occurs to me, one maybe reason, I just want to talk it through, to not put it in the equity policy is this, thinking about why this was so specific about school-sponsored curricular activities. We can't exclude anyone for financial reasons from curricular activities. We theoretically could, but would not exclude anyone from other sorts of activities. So maybe that's why this is separate. We can't do it, as opposed to we are choosing not to do it. But if we can't do it, we can't do it. Like, you almost don't need a policy. You can't do it. It still applies, right? So
I guess I'm thinking of a situation like, sometimes, like in elementary school, you'll get a homework assignment to make something. So there could be situations, it's not as obvious as a field trip, where you need the principal or the guidance counselor to step in, and they need to know they're supposed to make sure that they can.
the policies are really about the board directing the administration to do something. So what this one says is the responsibility of the superintendent or designee to review and designate such financial need and make arrangements for the full participation of students. If we just put that in the equity policy, I don't know. I'm having second thoughts about putting it in the equity policy, because I think this is really specific about if we want to implement some curricular anything, we always have to consider the possibility that someone's going to have a, difficulty getting an egg carton, to use Jen's example for a kindergarten sort of activity.
Why don't I do this? Why don't I revise this policy? And why don't I give you a mock-up of what it would look like inside the equity policy? And we can bring that back. And then see where it makes sense. Does that make sense? Thank goodness you have all these policies to tell the superintendent what to do. Otherwise, I would just be sitting around.
Any other comments on these first readings? No, that's it? Okay, so that brings us to public participation. Seeing no one approaching the microphone, we will close public participation. The next policy committee meeting is Wednesday, September 7th, 7 p.m., or immediately following the Education Committee.
I'm going to read all those policies, see what I have to do.
Okay, and with that, we are adjourned.